The first Twin Cities Pride was in, it was a walk down Nicollet Mall, and there was just a handful of people. Gene Shredder was one of them, who was the historian for Twin Cities Pride. He was actually on the board as the historian when I was. From that, they went and they walked down Nicollet Mall and went into Loring Park, just a handful of people. And now it is huge. From that handful of people to, roughly around 500,000 people we see today. And not only is it our celebration in the Twin Cities Pride, now the difference that I see are all these little pop-up prides that are happening all over the state, in the rural areas where they're needed. One thing I'd like to share with folks, and you asked me about pride, and I was ready for the question of, what does pride mean to you? And my question back would have been, which pride are you talking about? Are we talking about pride the movement? Are we talking about pride the festival? Or are we talking about pride the organization? And as we talk about pride, helping people understand that pride itself is a movement. There is a movement across the country. But then we also talk about pride the organization. There are pride organizers around the world that work to help these, some are only the festivals, some aren't any festivals, some help the community. So as we talk about pride, remember, there's a movement, there's an organization, and people tend to say this is what pride is, so your pride organizer should do this. And as a nonprofit, they don't always have the ability to do everything. But when we go to the festival portion of it, and they're trying to make a celebration for everybody. So, pride is an awesome movement as a whole.
An elder in the community that I got introduced as a young queer person when I came out was also a filmmaker, and he had produced a series called Generation Q. And as a young queer person, I had the opportunity in the 90s when I came out to go to a queer youth organization. This is where I got exposed to a lot of mentors in the political queer community, the political adult queer community, which has its pros and cons as a young queer person, and then other queer kids. And the queer kids came from other states, right? And I was already immersed in sort of the homeless, highly mobile community, and there's a lot of queer kids in there. And so it was this amazing experience of getting exposed to the lives and the perspectives of people from all over, and how queerness affected them, but we were related, and I think that that's, I don't know, I think that's a real gift. But my point is that this mentor, right? He is a filmmaker. He made the series Generation Q. He has since passed, but in that series, I watched that series, and I was like, oh, well, we should do a teachers conference, and we should invite educators to come learn about queer kids, right? And then as queer kids, we'll get on stage and talk about being queer in our own voice and blah, 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 and that whole stuff. And but there was a clip in one of his videos in the series that he did that just showed, it was probably from the 80s, showed appeared to be a white trans woman on stage at a Pride festival. And she was screaming at the top of her lungs. She was so angry at not being seen by her own community. But he put it in the documentary, right? And I remember being like, oh, that's who gave us Pride.
Early on in my sort of activism, I spent a lot more of my time raising visibility of our presence within the LGBT community. And what I sort of bumped into was a lot of sort of the bigotry and racism that exists within our community, and continues to exist, right? How exclusionary can be, and all of sort of the things that happen, and the inability for a lot of our community to sort of grapple with those complexities in terms of even with gender, age, race and sexuality and all those sorts of things. And, one of the things I think about for us, our continued sort of in the BIPOC community is to continue to maintain space for ourselves, to thrive, to develop our voices, to gain some understandings, and to figure out where we're going to sort of put our effort and our energy into.
You know, Twin Cities Pride really recognized that Pride is also a vital place for people of color. People of color need that space and need to interact and actually want to. So they've done some work. They've incorporated people of color on their Pride board and in their committee work. They've listened to us as people of color artists and, you know, us managing the Power to the People stage. And I've really seen a change in the last few years. Now we have one of the biggest areas at Pride. We take up a whole corner of the park. We have a whole area that's blue on the map that says this is a place for people of color. And we try to have food vendors and other cultural organizations that serve people of color. And then of course, artists serving people of color, all kinds of fierceness on the stage all day long.
The Power of the People stage was really a place to hold space for Black and brown, queer and trans identified folks who didn't really see themselves in the broader context of Pride. Pride has historically and continues to be a pretty white space, in the early days, it was sort of a male-dominated space. It didn't fully embrace the broader aspects of the community, the bisexual community, the lesbian community, and the trans community. Though it did have a very strong presence of drag, which is different from trans and gender nonconforming identity, but still it's a part of our history and my family. It's where I got the confidence to come out as a trans woman. So I deeply appreciate the drag community. But that Power to the People stage was a place where people could go and be.
Right, just being, like, loving yourself, accepting your identity, your intersectionalities, and just, like, knowing that it's okay to be you, it's okay to love the same gender, it's okay for you to have a non-conforming, like, gender identity, and just all in all, self-acceptance. I think that's what Pride is for me.
Yeah, and it can be hard to represent yourself sometimes if you're in a place where people, you know, they might be just not appreciated or might be outright dangerous for you to represent yourself. And having, like, a group or just even one other person that can support you or is even of that same, like, you know, facet of a personality that you are, like, even just having one other person and not being isolated from anyone else in your own community. Representation matters because it gives us the confidence to express ourselves more fluently.
I just want to connect with people. It feels so good to look in an audience and, like, see so many people that look like me or look like people in my community where they can feel safe, that I can make a space where they can come and celebrate themselves. They don't have to look over their shoulder. They can laugh about our stories, not like, oh, that's a similar situation. No, this is my situation. It feels like I'm on the top of the world. I love Minneapolis and I love what I do. I want everyone to feel, like, happy and loved and enough. Like, if I can do anything in my life, that's all I want, you know, truly.
I'm really interested in history in general. It's a subject that I'm passionate about, and I think that learning about trans, especially, and gender diverse stories from around the globe, and you know, especially pre-colonization, is very interesting. We're talking about early history here, obviously things that, you know, not every queer person is going to want to really like dive into. But I think that knowing the history of how diverse and how sort of multifaceted like gender and sexuality were considered, and knowing that a lot of what brought that to the cis heteronormativity that we know today was colonization and was European people invading these areas. And even though that is obviously very far in the past and probably, you know, isn't usually considered a part of queer history at all, we think about queer history as starting in the 1900s and having this community, you know, Stonewall, drag, it's like these things only about 60 years. But if we're talking about like really far back, you can actually understand that queerness was obviously present all around the world for a very long time before it ever had a name or ever was recognized, but also that these queer people were not always ostracized and cast out by society.
You know, the Treader collection at the U of M, Jean Treader was instrumental in creating an archive space at this amazing archive facility at the University of Minnesota, and many people who've contributed to the queer community here have their archives there, myself included. Those are the archives for Vulva Riot, for the Lesbian Avenger work, for much of the radio work that I did with Forbidden Fruit. A lot of the film projects that I worked on have been digitized, and those are available online. You know, if you're doing research and you want to like physically interact, you can make an appointment and go in there.
So Pride started out as a riot, right? And started out as a protest and started out, I mean, when you really think about it, and one of the things that I'm really pushing is that we have to remember who those people were. They were trans people. They were people of color. Like, that is important information as we move forward. And so there is still a piece of Pride that is a riot, that is a protest, that is like, no, we won't be quiet. And why this year, as I really looked at the theme, it was about elevating and amplifying our voices to say, no, we're not going to tolerate this. We are here, and this is who we are, and we shouldn't be shamed for that. And so the thing about the festival and, you know, the celebration is to look and celebrate how far we've come, but also remember that when I look at Loring Park and I see 600,000 people, that we're not alone, that's our community, our allies, and we are all different colors, and we need to celebrate that and be proud of that.
And then I would challenge people to get involved, you know, whether it's taking a volunteer shift during Twin Cities Pride or a lot of these little organizations that he's talked about, you know, get involved and see the work that needs to happen so that you understand, you know, that there are people fighting for you and your rights every single second of every single day.
Hey everybody, this is Andy, the Executive Director of Twin Cities Pride. This year we're asking you to tell your stories. Find Speak Minneapolis at the Twin Cities Pride Festival and share your Pride stories. Hope to see you there.